In this chapter on animal behavior, we're looking at all the ways that animals interact with other organisms and their physical environment. Earlier, we defined the idea that behavior is the change in activity of an organism in response to a stimulus. This could be something external or internal, or a combination of changes. As we think about behaviors, one of the things we want to understand is to know what causes it, how it develops within an individual, thinking about the idea of nature versus nurture, thinking about how it benefits that particular organism, and what is the potential evolutionary and ecological context to that. As you are moving along in this lecture, you will notice that a lot of the examples are human-related in comparison to animal-related. This may get you thinking about, is there truly a difference between human behavior and animal behavior? Well, this is something that I will leave for food for thought for you. After all, aren't humans animals anyway? So as you think about that, let's talk about some basic examples of well-known animal behaviors and how that could potentially correlate with the ecological and evolutionary success of those organisms throughout generations. As we think about animal behavior, it's important to understand that many scientists study animals in their natural habitat. This is what we know as ecology. As we look at the next few examples, these are things that were observed in most cases in an organism's natural habitat, simply based on observations, asking questions, developing hypotheses, and then drawing conclusions based on the observations that were obtained. If we begin with our first example, looking at Carl von Frisch and bee communication, what we observe in this particular example is von Frisch's Nobel Prize-winning research on honeybees and what they refer to as the waggle dance behavior. This would be later coined as dance language. What von Frisch recognized was that honeybees had a unique form of communication between themselves. He noted this by simply making the initial observation that as a bee moved to a feed source, it would shortly be joined by several other bees. He was curious if these particular honeybees were all from the same particular colony or hive. Thus, he continued to make observations. What he was able to see, based on observing these particular organisms, was that upon locating initial food source, worker bees would return to the hive or colony and pass the message along. They did this by performing a behavior which would now be referred to as the round versus the waggle dance. Upon returning to the hive, the worker bee who had located the food would perform a dance elevated above the hive and its inhabitants. The idea here was that the type of dance that was performed would suggest something about the particular food source. If we look, initially it was suggested that there was a very simplistic round dance that would be performed by those particular worker bees that had located the food source. This round dance suggested that food was located in a close proximity to the actual colony or hive. When we think close proximity, we're thinking about up to and no more than 50 meters. It was suggested that the complexity of the dance increased the further away that particular food source was. This dance was now known as the waggle. The waggle dance increased in complexity for two reasons. Not only to suggest a difference in the actual location, as far as how far away it was from the colony, but it also suggested the direction as well. Now, when we think about the waggle, this was utilized for food sources that were further than 50 meters away from the colony or hive. It can also be suggested that based on observations, the bees performing the waggle dance did this in different intensities. By observing the movement of the bees between the hive and the food source and the return message, we were able to determine that the more energetic the dance was performed by the worker bee would suggest the quality of the food as well. So thinking about higher energy dances would associate with a better food source or one that was higher quality to meet the needs of the organisms residing in that colony. That could be very important to think about and draw conclusions about what's happening inside the actual hive itself. What kind of activities? Are we preparing for hibernation in the winter? Is it during mating season? Or are there larval offspring that need to be tended to and fed? This is all something very important. Now, when we think about the honeybee communication, particularly with the dance language, to this date, there are still questions that are left unanswered, like so many behavioral studies. Thus, these organisms are still observed in their own living colonies, as well as observing phylogenetic and fossil studies. Both extinct and extant organisms are still being utilized to draw conclusions with regards to where, when, and why this dance language actually evolved. Bees weren't the only insect that was studied behaviorally. Early in the 20th century, Nico Tinbergen observed behaviors in digger wasps. More specifically, as we think about digger wasps, the organism of interest, what we noted here was looking at female digger wasps. They build their nests in small burrows within sandy grounds. Typically, it has been studied that those digger wasps make a nest that consists of multiple branching units with one tunnel. The idea here is that in each one of those branches, they lay a particular egg in hope of developing into a particular offspring. One may suggest, why are they laying their eggs in multiple tunnels? I'll lead you to think about why that's evolutionarily significant. Once the eggs are laid in these individual tunnels, it has been noted that the female digger wasp will leave the nest to go hunt for food. Unlike the honeybees that are primarily feeding on pollen and nectar of plants, wasps differ in the fact that they feed on other animals, such as honeybees. The wasp will leave the nest, hunt, and return with food, entering into the same nest. One of the things that Tinbergen was curious about is he noticed that with regards to the female digger wasps, he noted that there were several nests in close proximity to one another, and that the females would all leave within roughly the same time frame and return. He was curious whether or not they were returning to their specific nests or not. In his curiosity, that led him to study these organisms by performing a simple task. He first obtained the digger wasps as they were emerging from their nests and color-coded them, and then he observed them moving back and forth freely between their nest and their hunting ground. He observed that it was true that once the female left their nest, hunted, and returned, they were returning to the nest from which they emerged. He was curious how they were able to identify their particular nest in comparison to other organisms and other nests. He speculated that this had to do with the idea of landmarks. Thus, what he did was a very simple assessment. Looking at our first image here, this depicts the first portion of his study. After making observations, he simply took pine cones and arranged them in a circular formation around the nest. He noted that upon emerging from the nest, the female would elevate herself above the area, circle around a few times prior to hunting. She would then return and enter directly into the center of the pine cones, entering into her specific nest. He continued to observe this for multiple trials, exhibiting the same thing over and over. He then was curious about the fact if she was identifying her nests or if she truly was utilizing the landmarks of the pine cones that he set up. So he set up a second experiment to which, upon emerging from her particular nest, she observed the pine cone placement as shown in image number 1. Nico then removed those particular pine cones and repositioned them, retaining in a circular position, but outside of the nesting area. Upon return to the nest, the female flew into the center of the pine cones rather than returning to her particular nest. Hence, this speculates that the landmarks themselves were being utilized to locate that particular nest. In one final experiment, Nico wanted to see if the landmarks themselves were what the particular female digger wasp was observing, or was it the arrangement of the landmarks? So once again, he set up a trial where he initially allowed pine cones to be formed in a circular formation around the nest. Upon emerging, the female digger wasp once again performed her particular study, in which she emerged, flew around the area at a particular time, and then went off to hunt. During her hunting, Nico moved the particular pine cones rather than a circular shape. He moved them in a triangular shape as shown below in our third image. You will also note that he, in two, added a circular image or circular formation of stones. Upon the return from hunting, the female digger wasp returned to the circular formation of the stones rather than the pine cones. The idea here was thinking about whether it was the arrangement or the landmarks themselves that she was drawn to. It can be said that it's the arrangement of landmarks rather than the actual landmark itself. So thinking about, was she truly interested in identifying the pine cones, or just looking at overall basic shape as an idea of where her nest was located? This is something important to think about when we think about ecology and the environment and how different ecosystems are changing over time. How could this potentially affect the overall survival rate of organisms? Thinking about their ability to breed and reproduce and keep offspring around throughout multiple, from generation to generation. In our third and final basic example, we're going to focus on Konrad Lorenz's study of imprinting in geese. When we think about the idea of imprinting, we're thinking about this concept that very young animals fix their attention on the first object to which it visually, auditorily, or tactilely comes into contact with, and therefore follows an object. This normally explains some of the relationships in nature between offspring and parent. In Konrad Lorenz's study, he took a large clutch of goose eggs, and with the large clutch of goose eggs, he kept them until they were able to hatch. Just prior to hatching, he isolated half of them for himself, keeping them in the incubator in which they were being stored. He returned half of them to the goose mother. Now, the idea here was that upon hatching, if we are observing the idea of imprinting, this particular behavior, we would see that upon hatching that those goslings would form a relationship with the first particular object that it comes into contact with, assuming that that object is moving or providing some sort of stimulus. After all, behavior is a response to a particular stimulus. Upon hatching, the naturally hatched baby goslings followed their mother, where the ones in the incubator followed Lorenz. This should make sense based on this concept of imprinting, as the goslings that hatched with mother present observed her movements and began to follow her, where the ones provided in the incubator came into first contact with Lorenz's movement. To ensure that imprinting had actually occurred, as Lorenz was skeptical initially as to see if the geese were truly following her route because of imprinting or just because he was the only available thing. What he did to ensure that imprinting had occurred, as Lorenz put all of the goslings together under an upturned box, and he allowed them to interact with one another in this particular box, making sure that he had marked them so that they could identify which 6 goslings were imprinted theoretically on him and those that were interacting initially with mom. When the box was removed, the 2 groups of goslings separated themselves respectively to their mothers, half to the actual goose and the other half to Lorenz. Imprinting does not appear to be actively immediately after hatching. This is something that's very important, as we know that we have been taught from the very beginning, particularly when it comes to bird species, even other small mammal species, that if we see them, quote unquote, abandoned from their mother, to not touch them, as mom will return and provide guidance. The idea here, when we think about the concept of imprinting and how the parental versus offspring relationship builds and those behaviors occur, is we see this occurring the most strongest between 12 and 17 hours post-hatching when we're observing birds, suggesting that they are more likely to bind to something that they have repeated stimulus to, as far as movement, tactile, or auditory stimulation within that time frame. This is something that is extremely interesting because as we think about each one of these examples, von Frisch's honeybee communication, Tinbergen's female digger wasps, and landmark identification for nests, or Lorenz's imprinting in geese, we need to think about what these behaviors do for those particular organisms to make them more successful. We also need to think about the concept of, are these behaviors considered something that is innate, instinctual, or learned? And does that make a difference with regards to the overall success rate of those particular organisms? This is one thing that we observe in nature. When we observe organisms through the idea of ecology, how those animals are behaving in their natural habitat, it allows us to draw conclusions with very little intervention. Now we can take it to the next level as genetic testing has changed through modern technology over the past decades. And we can see if there truly is a correlation between many of these behaviors and the genetics of those organisms. This may suggest something about the potential success of those organisms as we move forward. As always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. I'm available via email and via Zoom upon appointment.